Okay, the second of three stories in the method of public narrative is the story of us. So, one way of thinking about a story of us is that it comes from the common points, the natural points of convergence that we hear when we exchange our stories of self. When we hear someone talking about their experiences, their challenges, their struggles, and we see similarities between the things we've gone through, that's when we can start to form a new identity, a new team, a new campaign. That's one way. Another way is that a team or community that has an older history draws upon experiences from the past, including from ancestors and predecessors, that help define what is the unique identity of that group and give it its sense of purpose. So another way of thinking about a story of us is that it's an answer to this question: who are we? What are we called to do? And that can happen either from finding similarities between our individual experiences, if we're starting a new campaign, a new team, a new organization, or it can come from a deeper ancestral past. Professor Gann says, we tell stories of self to enable others to understand us, to show the values which have called us to take leadership. We tell a story of us to enable us to understand one another, that is, to show the values we share and that can move us to act. To take collective action, to find courage in each other, support in each other, find hope to get through difficulty, to get through feelings of discouragement, feelings that the powers of the world are against us, right? This is where we need the kind of hope and solidarity that comes from a story of us. Marshall says, we tell more stories of us every day than almost any other kind of story. Moments of, hey, do you remember when? Around the table, or about an old project, or just memories that make us smile. So a story of us, in this sense, is a story of shared experience, challenges that we were confronted with, obstacles we overcame or not, values that we have tested or that have tested us, and lessons we have learned and that have made us who we are today. This us that a storyteller brings to life in the stories is less based on a demographic category about ethnicity or sex or language, and rather, in Marshall's teaching, about values that we share, that are anchored in a common experience, an us that comes from experience, not an us that comes from how we look or other things about our identity that we don't choose, but rather the things that we do choose, that we experience as we go through together. Learning how to tell a story of us, you can bring to life common values as a source of real energy, solidarity, hope, motivation. That's what Marshall. This is not just to make ourselves feel better. It's to give ourselves the resources we need to take action, and often in very difficult situations. An interesting insight that comes from contemporary social science. This is a book called The Power of Us by Jay Van Bavel and Dominic Packer, who collectively together have done a lot of research into what makes groups feel like groups, what makes groups of individuals feel like greater than the sum of their parts. And what they propose is that human beings have two fundamental but often contradictory motivations. We need both to belong and feel respected and part of an identity, and we want to stand out. We feel drawn to collaborate and also drawn to compete. And these two feelings can come into conflict. But what they say is that the groups that are the most highly functional, that achieve the greatest things, are the ones that integrate these two needs, that put these two needs together in a common direction. They say high-functioning groups tend to share a delightful feeling of distinction from the rest of society, as well as a deep feeling of belonging to their own group. Achieving this kind of balance, satisfying both these needs to belong and the need to stand out, is one of the reasons that certain groups feel irresistibly attractive to us. One way of thinking about this is that this is balance between the need to conform and fit in, and the need to distinguish ourselves and stand out, and that groups that they call optimally distinct allow us to stand out together. So I'll give you examples of this. When I go abroad as an American, I realize that Americans are very distinct, are looked at as very distinct kind of people from other countries. But what we fail to do in my lifetime is find ways of sticking together, right? Of sharing common values, the kind of common values that brought people together to fight the Great Depression or World War II have really been lost in the last generation, and we find ourselves more and more divided and polarized. Whereas another experience, working for a law firm, we do have conformity to common values, common behaviors, common ways of dressing, but there was nothing that was really distinct about this law firm that I worked in. A great bunch of people, but people came and left and went to different places because it was a place of feeling of belonging, but not of distinct. You could easily belong to another place, and so neither being an American in 2025 nor being a lawyer at a New England law firm satisfied what Van Bavel and Packer would call the recipe of optimal distinctiveness. One way of thinking about optimal distinctiveness, and as in the background of building a story of us, is two dimensions of collective identity. One dimension is the things you see, right? The logos, the colors, the flags, the physical, the statues, the artifacts, the mosques, the churches, the museums, the common spaces. That's part of one dimension. Other things that we'd include in this dimension, we could call the symbolic dimension, are the kind of words we use, the jargon, the acronyms, the inside jokes, the references, the things that we commonly do together. We have meetings, or we pray, or we have meals together. These are things that are visible manifestations of that collective identity. And then there's a second dimension that gets to something, less visible. Points of pride, the challenges overcome in the past, the specific values that guide our behaviors and critical choices, the things we don't joke about. And more often than not, these kinds of features of our collective identity are communicated in stories of things that our ancestors, our predecessors were able to accomplish, whether it's founding fathers or the leaders of an independence movement or civil rights leaders, great cultural figures. These are the stories that give us this less visible, but maybe deeper and even more emotionally gripping parts of our identity. So a story of us will communicate something about both of these dimensions, the symbolic dimension, the things we can see and hear and feel, as well as this deeper dimension of values that come from the stories of our past experience and difficult decisions made and challenges surmounted. So I want to illustrate this with a story of us that comes from a very interesting company, a very unusual company that sells mountaineering and outdoors equipment, but that has really transformed a notion of a company's responsibility to nature and society and the wider world. It's Patagonia. So here's how they tell their story of us. Yvan Chouinard, Patagonia's founder, got his start as a climber in 1953 as a 14-year-old member of the Southern California Falconry Club. One of the adult leaders, Don Prentice, taught the boys how to rappel down the cliffs to the Falcon Eyries where the falcons lived. This simple lesson sparked a lifelong love of rock climbing in Yvan. In 1957, Yvan went to a junkyard and bought a used coal-fired forge, a 130-pound anvil, and some tongs and hammers, and started teaching himself how to blacksmith. Chouinard made his first piton from an old harvester blade and tried them out with T.M. Herbert on early ascents of the Lost Arrow Chimney on the north face of Sentinel Rock in Yosemite. These are popular places to go mountain climbing in Yosemite National Park, which is one of the great parks in the west of the U.S. The word spread, and soon friends had to have Chouinard's chrome molybdenum steel piton. Before he knew, these are the things you hammer into the rock face that help you climb up. Before he knew it, he was in business. He could forge 2 of his pitons in an hour and sold them for $1.50 each. Chouinard built a small shop in his parents' backyard in Burbank. In Yosemite, he and his friends had to hide out from the rangers in the boulders above Camp 4 after they overstayed the 2-week camping limit. They took pride in the fact that climbing rocks and ice falls had no economic value, that they were rebels. Their heroes were John Muir, Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, great philosophers of the outdoors, as well as mountain climbers like Gaston Rebufat, Ricardo Cassin, Herman Buell. In 1965, Yvon went into partnership with Tom Frost and started Chouinard Equipment. During the 9 years that Frost and Chouinard were partners, they redesigned and improved almost every climbing tool to make them stronger, lighter, simpler, and more functional. Their guiding design principle came from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the French aviator, who said, "In anything at all, perfection is finally attained, not when there is no longer anything to add, but when there is no longer anything to take away, when a body has been stripped down to its nakedness." By 1970, Chouinard Equipment had become the largest supplier of climbing hardware in the United States. It had also become an environmental villain because its gear was damaging the rock. The same fragile cracks had to endure repeated hammering of pitons during both placement and removal, and the disfiguring was severe. Chouinard and Frost decided to minimize the piton business. This was to be the first big environmental step we would take over the years. Fortunately, there was an alternative, aluminum shocks that could be wedged by hand rather than hammered in and out of cracks. And if you're a mountain climber out there, if I'm pronouncing these terms wrong, you can correct me afterwards. We introduced them in the first Chouinard Equipment catalog in 1972. A 14-page essay by Sierra climber Doug Robinson on how to use chocks appeared in the catalog, paving the way for future environmental essays in Patagonia catalogs. Within a few months of the catalog's mailing, the piton business had atrophied. Chocks sold faster than they could be made. Chapter 2, Let My People Go Surfing. We began to grow at a rapid pace. At one point, we made Inc. magazine's lists of the fastest-growing privately held companies. That rapid growth came to a halt in 1991, when a recession crimped our sales and the bank called in our revolving loan. To pay off the debt, we had to lay off 20% of our workforce, many of them friends and friends of friends. We had become dependent on growth we couldn't sustain. Yvon took his top managers to Patagonia to reflect on the kind of business Patagonia should be. We were able in many ways to keep alive our cultural values, even during the heavy growth years and after the shock of the 1991 layoffs. We were surrounded by friends at work who could dress however they wanted, even barefoot. People ran or surfed at lunch or played volleyball in the sandpit at the back of the building. The company sponsored ski and climbing trips for employees. Many more trips were undertaken informally by groups of friends who would drive up to the Sierra on Friday night and arrive home, groggy but happy, in time for work on Monday morning. Since 1984, we've had no private offices, an architectural arrangement that sometimes creates distractions but also keeps our communication open. That same year, we opened a cafeteria that serves healthy, mostly organic food. The only thing that doesn't change here is the famous rice and beans served every Monday. We also opened, at Melinda Chouinard's insistence, an on-site childcare center. At the time, one of only 150 in the whole country. Today there are thousands, though still not enough. The presence of children playing in the yard or having lunch with their parents in the cafeteria helps keep the company atmosphere more familial than corporate. In 2015, we were recognized by President Obama for our commitment to working families. Third and final chapter in our version of the story of us here. Friends of the Ventura River. Patagonia was still a fairly small company when we started to devote time and money to the increasingly apparent environmental crisis. We began to read about global warming, the cutting and burning of tropical forests, the rapid loss of groundwater and topsoil, acid rain, the ruin of rivers and creeks from silting over dams, reinforced what we saw with our eyes and smelled with our noses during our travels. At the same time, we slowly became aware that uphill battles fought by small, dedicated groups of people to save patches of habitat could yield significant results. The first lesson came right here at home in the early 70s. A group of us went to a city council meeting to help protect a local surf break from a development plan. That's where a river comes and meets the ocean, and it's a good place to surf. We knew vaguely that the Ventura River had once been a major steelhead habitat. Steelhead's a kind of fish. Then, during the 40s, 2 dams were built and water diverted. Except for winter rains, the only water left at the river mouth flowed from the sewage plant. At that city council meeting, several experts testified that the river was dead, and that channeling the mouth would have no effect on remaining birds and wildlife or on the surf break. Things looked grim until Mark Capelli, a 25-year-old biology student, showed photos he had taken along the river. Of the birds that lived in the willows, of the muskrats and water snakes, of eels that spawned in the estuary. He even showed a slide of a steelhead smolt. Yes, 50 or so steelhead still came to spawn in our quote-unquote dead river. The development plan was defeated. We gave Mark office space and a mailbox and small contributions to help him fight the river's battle. As more development plans cropped up, the Friends of the Ventura River worked to defeat them, to clean up the water, and to increase its flow. Wildlife multiplied, and more steelhead fish began to spawn. Mark taught us two important lessons: that a grassroots effort, meaning a local bottom-up effort, could make a difference, and that degraded habitat could, with effort, be restored. His work inspired us. We began to make regular donations to smaller groups working to save or restore habitat, rather than give the money to NGOs with big staffs, overheads, and corporate connections. In 1986, we committed to donating 10% of profits each year to these groups. We later upped the ante to 1% of all sales, profit or not. We have kept that commitment every year since. The formation of 1% for the planet in 2002 made it easy for other companies to do the same. September 2022. The Earth is now our only shareholder. Nearly 50 years after Yvan Chouinard began his experiment in responsible business, ownership of Patagonia is transferred to two new entities, the Patagonia Purpose Trust and the nonprofit Holdfast Collective. Every dollar that is not reinvested into Patagonia will be distributed as dividends to protect the planet. Instead of extracting value from nature and transforming it into wealth, we are using the wealth Patagonia creates to protect the source, said Chouinard. I am dead serious about saving this planet. So, we see in the story of us, and this is just a selection from the story they have on their website, the same structure. Let's analyze it. So the first chapter on the origins of Patagonia, we see the initial spark, the passion for climbing, and then this prise de conscience, this realization that the initial products that Yvan Chouinard was building with his partners was actually damaging the rock that gave them this joyful connection to nature, and so they could keep growing the business as they had built it, or they could try to reduce the damage and put their profitability at risk. And so they rejected this choice as a false choice. And they said, no, this is going to force us to innovate. And so they created this new product of aluminum, which ended up being able to accomplish the same goal, but without the environmental damage. And they ended up being even more profitable and successful for the company. The second chapter is about the company culture. And we see the challenge related to the company grows rapidly, but it uses these traditional financing mechanisms that when the economy turns down into a recession, leads to 20% of the employees being laid off. And this, again, it calls them to make a choice. What kind of business culture do we want? And the choice is not just the choice made in 1991 during the recession, but we see that it's a series of choices that each of them accumulate to create a culture of more that's more humane and more family-centered. So we see they give us this list of different choices about the open space offices, which again makes less privacy but more open communication. The choice to let people play sports and volleyball, maybe less time behind their desks, selling things, but that make them more productive and happy overall. Weekend trips, again, maybe makes them tired on a Monday morning, but it gives them more, motivation and feeling of belonging, sense of purpose. The child care center, again, an expense that not every company was willing to do, but that ended up showing what kind of culture they were. And finally, this dead river. This was a punctum in the story. That they said the river was dead. We can imagine that dead fish, and the sense that they, one guy, this 25-year-old biology student, up against all of the city council and the real estate promoters, and then Patagonia, the people at that city council, what could they do to help? Well, what they saw was that they could, by giving a little bit of support to local actors like this guy Mark, could help build campaigns that could really help local habitats regenerate. And that early experience in the 1970s led to this greater sense of commitment and investment of resources from the company into this program 1% of the planet, and ultimately converting the company from a profit-generating enterprise to a purpose trust, the Patagonia Purpose Trust. And so we see also how we have both of these two dimensions of optimal distinctiveness. This dimension of values that comes from the choices they make in each of these three chapters, the rebellious streak, the idea of disrupting traditional ways of doing business, their love of nature, and also these little key details, these more visible things, the quotes from Saint-Exupéry, the barefoot volleyball, the Ventura River, the open space offices, the nursery, the child care center, the rice and beans on Monday, the phrase 1% for the planet. You see that these quotes and logos and traditions help build this sense of that we're a special community, and that deserves to, our loyalty, our effort, our energy, our loyalty. So this is how we create a story of us, right? We brainstorm about different key moments from the past. It could be moments of foundation, moments of crisis, of triumph, and this is a story that can be adapted to different populations, different moments where you need to, maybe you're onboarding a new employee, or you're giving a pep talk at the beginning of a project, or debrief at the end of a project. These are all different moments where we can tell a story of us. And so the idea is, you think about, what are the different important challenges we've experienced? What were the specific choices we have to make? And this is the hardest part of building a story, right? Is really slowing down and zooming in on the moment of choice. What were the alternatives? It could have been different, right? What was the easy path that we didn't take? Where do we get the motivation to make a difficult choice if it was a difficult one? What are the details that stick in the mind from those moments? And then the easier part is, okay, what do we learn from the outcome, and how does this story contribute to who we are today? How can it be a source of hope, a source of strategy also for how we advance as a community? Okay, our last video will be the story of now.